Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second talk for today. And I am so excited to have this conversation, which is called No One is Free Until We're All Free, Building Cross-Movement Coalitions to Achieve Collective Liberation. And it's a conversation. Okay, Sumaya, is that the correct way to say your name? No, it's okay? Sumaya's good enough?
Yes, that's perfect. Yes.
Sumaya Awad, who is a Palestinian American now, writer and activist based in New York City. She directs strategy and communication for the Adalah Justice Project. Her writings focus on Palestinian liberation, anti-imperialism, Islamophobia, and immigration. She's the co-author of Palestine and Elections in a collection called Strategy and Electoral Politics, released by Verso Books, Jacobin Magazine, and Haymarket Books. That's in 2019. She speaks widely at university and grassroots organizations across the country and is co-founder of Against the Canary Mission Project, which defends student activists targeted by blacklists for their Palestinian rights advocacy. Must be a very busy week for that. Her edited volume, Palestine, a Socialist Introduction, was released in December 2020. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule as a political activist, social activist. A lot is going on right now, so I'm so grateful that you're here. What I really wanted to focus this conversation on and I'm just going to recap a little bit what this whole project is to sort of put it in context. So this project is called Towards Re-embodying Equality, and what we're doing is I'm having conversations with academics, artists, and activists, and I'm just going to read you this quote, whose work challenges organized domination systems, transforms deeply ingrained cultural and societal norms, and creates new systems that prioritize, here's the list, nonviolence, gender equality, economic equality, environmental sustainability, and non-discrimination. So I'm going to start asking you my first question, which is the quote from that no one is free until all of us are free. And I want to ask you if you can explain to people what exactly collective liberation is and why that's so important to have these groups work together. Because I think that's something that's a little bit gotten lost in our particular time period where you see so many groups that are working independently. A little example, I'll just fill this in. I was just in Washington, D.C. It was a lobby day, and you sort of see literally the one group comes in and they're lobbying for, I was there for higher minimum wage. Then the next group comes in and they're coming in, they're lobbying about the water quality where they live. And then the next group is coming in and they're talking about, abortion rights. And I see all these movements, people are doing their separate things, but yet there is a connection in everything. And I wanted to ask you about how movements can come together and what you think, and in your experience as an organizer, how an activist, let's start with that.
Thanks so much, Jill. Thanks for having me on and to everybody listening. I think the core, the foundation of collective liberation and the quote that you stated, which is no one is free until we're all free, is that any struggle, all struggles that any one of us could be a part of in the United States are materially connected. And that when one thing is funded, it automatically means another thing is underfunded. When one group is oppressed, it's laying the groundwork for other groups in the future to also be oppressed. And that nothing exists in isolation, nothing exists in a vacuum, everything is connected. And there are many examples of this, but I'll point to two very quickly. The first is a lot of the work that I do with the Adalah Justice Project, which is the organization I'm a part of, is about Black Palestine solidarity, specifically in the United States. And the height of that we saw in Ferguson, Missouri, 10 years ago. This is the 10-year anniversary of Ferguson, Missouri. And one of the first things that happened in Ferguson, the police came in and cut down all the trees in the neighborhoods where Mike Brown was killed. And that specific tactic that they used was a tactic they learned from their police trainings with Israeli forces in Israel, because the police in Ferguson had been trained in Israel, had done joint trainings. And that was a tactic that Israeli soldiers had used against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza back then in 2014, and that they had taken and given to, trained the US police on, and that was then used in Ferguson as a way to quell and surveil protesters. That's one example. The other example I want to give is about climate justice in Palestine, because that's so important. And often people who are environmentalists think like, what do I have to do with Palestine? Why should I care?
Yeah.
The reality is that a lot of the laws that are being passed, the legislation that's being passed in various states across the country, targeting climate activists and persecuting them, is a law that was actually adopted almost word for word by those who had been going after Palestine boycott activists. So, you know, in a number of states across the country, there are campaigns to boycott anything that is related to the Israeli military, anything that reproduces apartheid, because that's against international law. And the same laws that were written in state legislative bodies in 23 states, they were taken, they changed the wording that was about Israel and Palestine and changed it into climate activism and environmentalism, and that adopted those laws. And one of the most famous cases of this is a law that was passed in Colorado targeting climate activists. And so this is what we mean by our struggles are connected. The way that they come after and repress and silence Palestine activists is the way that they're doing that to Black activists, to climate activists, to Indigenous activists, and the list goes on.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to go, I really want to talk to me about social justice in general. So from the Adalah Social Justice Project, there are sort of three ways that you work with your activism. And I wanted to ask you how that exactly works in terms of, so here are the different areas that maybe you can give a little bit of an intro to. You know, education, what does that mean? Because I think a lot of people are getting their news from Instagram or TikTok, or really, we all know people are getting completely different news stories that are different idea of what truth is that are, you know, it's a Rashomon kind of effect. So I want to ask about the how you do education in a world where the news sources are completely so unaligned, and also advocacy. What kind of advocacy you do? I'm interested in, do you what that means in terms of political versus getting people to organize, and what you think the importance of, let's go through all this out, and then you can go from there. You know, people organizing on the street, how does that work to change lives and actually change policy versus sort of doing direct activism at the Hill, or writing your representatives versus being on the street. And well, yeah, let's just start with that. So first of all, education in a world where people are getting different information. Second of all, the forms of sort of protest versus advocacy for political solutions.
Great. Yeah, so in terms of education, we do a couple of things. I think we have always known, and it's always been the case in not just the Palestine coverage of Palestine, but other struggles in general, that the mainstream news sources are lacking. And that's like a nice way of saying it. They are much more than just lacking. And certainly in the last 6 months, we've seen what stories get covered and what don't, who gets smeared and who doesn't. And so alternative avenues for education have become incredibly important. And so one of the things we do is we offer 101 workshops, like history 101s, or workshops that talk about the connection between the Palestinian struggle and other struggles here in the US. And we have people who are experts in these fields, who have been studying it for a long time, but aren't just studying it, aren't just academics, they're academics and also organizers, because we think it's actually really key to learn from organizers in this long trajectory, the long arc of organizing around any struggle in the US and how they're connected. And so we offer these 101 workshops. We also do, I mean, I do this in particular, a lot of visiting campuses across the country to talk with students, answer their questions, making it clear that there's no question that's too silly or too simple. That oftentimes it's true that these subjects can be very complicated, and also in the same breath, we can say that you don't have to know everything to know that you should stand up against genocide and against apartheid. Another thing we do is we work with research organizations to map out the companies that are complicit in the genocide, or complicit in the militarism on the US-Mexico border, or complicit in the oppression of indigenous communities here in the US. And so then we do workshops with organizers to let them understand, here are the useful targets. It's not really useful to just target anyone or everyone, right? That actually doesn't change anything. So thinking about coordination and strategy. And then we actually use social media quite a bit. I mean, I think there's a lot of pros and cons to social media. Obviously, it means that a lot of things get out there that are not true or that are exaggerated. But there's also a power to social media, and especially right now, one of the core components of how we view news and information is to really center the voices of people on the ground, to center the voices of the people who are most impacted. And there are still journalists in Gaza. There are still Palestinian journalists reporting from the ground. And so we do our best to highlight their voices, to center their voices, and to also constantly be in touch with them so that we know what messaging to put out, so that they can help guide what our demands should be here in the US. So that's to your first question. To your second question about DC and the Hill versus the grassroots.
I'm talking
Yeah.
like, writing to your, many people are writing to their congressmen or trying to make sort of political change, which may or may not happen. I don't know, maybe we could talk about that, but versus sort of the kind of protesting we see on the streets. And yeah, I want to get your opinion on the different ways.
I mean, it's a really, really great question. I think it's a question that different struggles have grappled with throughout history.
That's why
I
I
think,
asked that, because it's a big question.
yeah, totally. I think what we've learned for the last 6 months is that both are equally important, that both complement one another, and that both have actually shifted things tremendously in the US context. So when you think about the grassroots in the US, in the aftermath of October 7th, when Israel began bombarding Gaza and killing civilians, just indiscriminately killing people, bombing entire apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, and there were these mass protests across the US. These protests across the US and the unrest that was happening in workplaces, in schools, on campuses, etc., is what pushed and pressured and inspired members of Congress to draft the ceasefire resolution. So the ceasefire resolution, I believe, was published on October 18th, either October 17th or October 18th. And it was inspired by and pushed by this massive grassroots response. And so that's why I say they complement each other. Afterwards, after it was introduced, when it was introduced, there were very few. I mean, we could count them on our hands, the number of Congress people that were signed on. That number today is over 55. And the reason that number today is over 55 members of Congress is because of the grassroots. It's because of the lobbying, yes. It's because of the tens of thousands of people that called their members of Congress. But a lot of these people, the way they learned about the importance of calling, the way they realize that they have a role to play has to do with the grassroots movements, the fact that people are protesting almost every day, the fact that high school students were walking out of school and saying, this has to do with our future, and we refuse to be complicit. The fact that during the State of the Union protest, that was all over CNN. So it became clear, I think, the grassroots makes it clear to people across the country that you have a role to play in this. And even 4 months, 5 months, 6 months into this genocide, you still have a role to play. And so I think the two complement each other a lot. And both are so, so important.
Can I ask you, thank you for that, but about the role of social media in that? Because some people like me like repost things, and people, you feel like a little like it's not performative, but does that really have an impact? And I know people are saying, please, please repost. Can you talk about how that impacts people, or the role of social media, the positive side, as opposed to the part that we all know we're getting different information, and I'm getting one story and you're getting a different story in your feed, but what can be the positive impact of social media in this particular, and not only this struggle, but in all struggles for freedom and liberation?
Definitely. I think social media plays a big role, and I think it's easy to get lost in the performativity of it. And I think it's important for us to, be conscious of that. Like, what you do shouldn't just be what you do on social media. But I think when you post, when you repost things, when you uplift voices from on the ground in Palestine, or when you uplift the voices of Black organizers organizing in St. Louis, Missouri, or in Mississippi, et cetera, or Indigenous organizers demanding land back, what you're doing is you're ensuring that everyone that follows you and the algorithms that are created by these different platforms understand that this is something that's talked about, that this is something that's still important. And that's especially important right now because people are afraid to speak out. People are really afraid to speak out. And oftentimes we don't understand that there's actually we have an impact on others when they see us post or repost something that makes them feel a little bit more confident in speaking out. or indicates to them that you are someone they can talk to about this, even if they're not ready to speak out. You're someone who's safe that they can talk to without feeling judged, without feeling any pressure. And I think that goes a really long way. It works in ways that are hard to measure,
Okay.
but it has an impact for sure. And it doesn't hurt. It can only help. And with the algorithms in particular, it's important because right now we know there's data that's come out that's been leaked by workers at Instagram and Facebook or Meta, as well as Twitter, as well as TikTok, that anything related to Palestine and Gaza is being censored. You're not seeing it as much. It's not being pushed out on stories as much. And so the more people post and share and talk about it, the more we can push back against these these attempts to use the algorithm to silence us. And so for that reason as well, it's really, really important.
You brought up something interesting. This is a little bit personal, but I know you went to Columbia University approximately 10 years ago or whatever, a bit ago. And you were active, as were many students we knew, on the campus. And I know you said now that you also go visit college campuses now. And I'm interested, I know there's been a big shift of, well, that's what I want to ask you. So can you, since you went to Columbia and that's a real practical experience, you were part of these groups at Columbia. Can you talk about what it's like on college campuses now? Because I think many people who are listening to this are a long way from college campuses and haven't been there. And I think it's really important to understand the difference when you were there and what's happening now. So in your opinion on that, and visiting college campuses. And Columbia you know quite well because you live near there and went there. So that'd be great to inform.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked. And that you mentioned Columbia, because like right now, as we speak here today, students have just been arrested. Students that were involved in encampment on Columbia's main lawn, demanding that their university stop suspending students, stop silencing them, stop investing in Israeli apartheid and genocide, and to reverse the block on student organizing on campus. And the response from Columbia, they had been out there since yesterday at 5 a.m. And about 49 minutes ago, Columbia sent in full riot gear police onto student encampment. They have all been arrested, yeah, and they are in giant prison buses where they put the arrested students. However,
can we just repeat it? They were peacefully protesting. I want to be really clear so everyone understands this.
They were peacefully protesting.
So wait, I need you to go back on that because let's talk about the banning of, talk about it when you were there, the groups you were part of and how those groups were banned. Because to me, that is still shocking. I don't understand how universities are banning these groups from protesting. So we need to go back a little bit, unpack what you just said.
Back to when they were banned in the fall.
When you were there, what it was like. You were part of these groups at Columbia.
When I was there, the campus administration, it was a different president, just as difficult and just as repressive. But he, at the time, a lot of anything that, it was Students for Justice in Palestine when I was there, and anything we wanted to do, any event, any campaign, we would have to go through so many more hurdles than other campus groups in order to get funding approved, in order to get speakers approved, in order to get spaces booked. And in one instance, I remember there was a banner drop. We did a banner drop on campus, and that banner was taken down. And we were threatened with suspension. Several students were threatened with suspension. And then the group, Students for Justice in Palestine, was threatened with suspension. And we had to go through a whole disciplinary process in response to this. Meanwhile, on campus, when I was there, we built a mock apartheid wall in the middle of campus to sort of showcase this is what Palestinians have to go through every day. And that this mock apartheid wall is built by the same Israeli company that also built and is responsible for the military technology on the US-Mexico border. And at the time, there was a student at Columbia who was an ex-Israeli soldier who came to the wall and actually physically harassed one of the Arab students there. And this was caught on camera, and a report was written, and the campus administration did nothing. And similarly, in the fall, just a couple of months ago, when Palestinians and Palestine solidarity activists, students at Columbia were protesting the genocide on campus, during one of these rallies, an ex-Israeli soldier came to the rally, and this was also caught on camera, and used pepper spray and skunk spray, which is actually something that Israelis do all the time, against the students there. And this was caught on camera, and several of them actually had to go to the hospital. And one of them had burns, and this like lasted for a week. And all of this was caught on camera. All of this was documented. It's been covered in various news sources, and Columbia University did nothing to that student. And so there's a lot of continuity in what was going on when I was there and what's going on now, except for right now it's at a heightened rate. The repression is heightened.
They banned all the groups from protesting. What happened at Columbia this last year? Did they not ban the groups from?
They banned, in the fall, they banned Students for Justice in Palestine, and they banned Jewish Voice for Peace from organizing on campus. However, what they didn't realize is when those two groups were banned, 70 other student groups on campus came together, 70, came together, 70, 70, came together and created a coalition that took up all the demands that these two other student groups were calling for. So Columbia tried to repress all this activism. Instead, what it got is even more student groups involved, even more students wanting their voice heard.
Protests on a college campus for which there is a long history. There's a long history, we all know, of peaceful protests on college campuses. Okay, so now we're getting to today. You have these students who are peacefully protesting. They're not inciting violence. Let's just be clear, can you exactly explain what the students were doing?
Yeah, they set up tents on the campus lawn. So they also weren't shutting down any walkways. And they had their demands very clear. They had them put up on like canvases in front of the tents saying, we want the school to divest. We want the school to allow students to organize. We want the school to stop silencing our voices. And they said, we're going to camp out here indefinitely until we reach these demands. And actually, one of the students is Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's daughter, who is a third year at Barnard College. And she was one of the students that was suspended this morning. She was suspended. The one Muslim student suspended, which is her, and then two Jewish students were suspended. All three of them were part of organizing around Palestine on campus. So the students are peacefully there. Columbia shut down the campus, as in you can only enter if you're a student and you show ID, and they shut down every single entrance and exit except for one. This happened last night. This morning, police with full riot gear showed up, and buses to arrest people showed up to take them away. And then about an hour ago, the official ruling came out from the president. It was sent out in a mass email saying everyone who is there will be arrested. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. However, community members, faculty, students, and alum all showed up, and they surrounded these police buses with the arrested students inside, refusing to let them out. And that was about 20 minutes ago. I'm not sure what happened because I'm here with you, but that was the latest.
Wow. Now, has this happened? Could you have a context for this, since you know about, like, say, Vietnam or other times when these kind of protests happen? Because it seems like so nonviolent. It doesn't seem like it would be, I don't really know their grounds for doing this. How does that work in the history of protest at college campuses? Is this different?
It's different, as in it hasn't happened quite like this in decades. The last time we saw something to this extent, where people were arrested in this way, where the response from campus was so violent, I think I would say would either be during the apartheid South Africa movement, like the movement to boycott, divest from apartheid South Africa, so in the late 80s, or Vietnam. In 1968 at Columbia there was also a massive student encampment. They took over Hamilton Hall, and that was also met with police riot gear, arrests, violence, beating up. So it's been a long time since something like this has happened.
And I want to add in one thing. I think how much we have 5 minutes. In terms of the silencing and censoring, which I think is a really important issue, the speaker from USC, do you want to talk a little bit about her? It's again an example of sort of silencing and people not being able to tell their stories, which I think has huge precedent for all kinds of things. And this, in a way, is linking it to other movements, which I feel like is really important, is that, and you can talk about that, is people specifically being silenced and censored. And the particular example is the class valedictorian. Also, because I want to go back to college campuses, because I think that's really important, but about what happened at USC, which has gotten a lot of press also in the last few days. But again, silencing. So if you want to.
Yeah, I think the example of USC is a really good one, because the way they're silencing the student, whose name I believe is Asna, is by saying, we're doing this for your own safety.
They said was security.
Right. And it's just so ridiculous, because if that were really the case, then you would take the side of the student and the students and the message they're trying to put forward and make sure they're safe in delivering it, and not take the side of these threats that are coming in. And what's happening to her and what's happening at USC is actually something that we're seeing happening across the country, where valedictorians are being prevented from speaking, or when speeches are being vetted beforehand, and people are being said no based on what they're saying. I mean, there was a hearing in Congress yesterday where the president of Colombia was actually there, Shafiq, and where the verdict in the end was that the banning of the saying from the river to the sea. And it's this type of repression and silencing it would be laughable if it weren't so violent. And it also sets a precedent, because if they're doing this right now with the Palestine movement, they could do the exact same thing with any other struggle, whether it's a struggle for abortion rights, which is incredibly important and obviously under attack, or this, the indigenous struggle, or Black Lives Matter. So when they censor one group, this sets a precedent for censoring any other group in the future. And I think that's what's so key and why it's important to fight back against it. And with the USC example in particular, if this happens, if we let this happen and don't push back and, just use every tool we have to push back, then they could do this next year and the year after. And all these spaces can become spaces where our voices are not heard. Any one of us that wants to be heard are not heard and are silenced and are repressed, and are surveilled. And I think that's really, really scary, what kind of precedent this sets for where the future of this country is headed.
Right, and that's, I mean, we all believe that these systems need to be changed, and part of this has to do with free speech, and we all know this is like to peacefully be able to express your ideas, both in the media and tell your stories, and have the press, wherever we have in America, to tell stories, and also people to be able to protest, seems like basic rights ingrained in the US Constitution. I mean, is that not correct? Is that not the very sort of beginning of the US Constitution? And it seems like these rights are completely, in this particular issue, being denied in many ways. So if you want to finish up on the same idea of how this really,
Yeah.
why this is so important that everyone understands this, because if this happens in every context, for people fighting for freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right that it's a slippery slope when we allow these things to start happening with any struggle, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant it is. It's a slippery slope, and it'll start happening in all areas of life, in our workplaces, on campuses, certainly, because that's already happening. And then it'll start being used in Congress too, about what you can and can't say as a member of Congress. And we're already starting to see this. And that's incredibly, incredibly dangerous, especially as we think of this is an election year. What are the next 4 years going to look like? If this is happening already now, what does that mean for a year or 2 years from now? So it's especially important right now to take a really strong stance and make sure this doesn't snowball.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jill, for having me here, and everyone else for
I
listening.
have to get back because it's a very busy day. And thank you all so much for listening. I'm just so grateful we could have this talk, and I hope people listen and understand, are just open to listening. That's really the most thing. I think we have to practice sort of radical listening, and hearing from people who are on the ground and who are, their stories. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful.